Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere sunbaked and silent down into the amber dust of the Mesopotamian plains, where the shadows of crumbling ziggurats stretch like time itself. You're barefoot, the clay earth warm even after sunset, and the breeze smells faintly of ancient reeds and fire ash. The sky is that pink-orange gradient you only get in places with no light pollution, just an infinite dome, as it was 5,000 years ago. And under that sky, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, a civilization figured out something shockingly modern. You can let the sun do the work for you. You probably won't survive this if you're a loaf of barley bread left too long in a solar oven. Because here in ancient Mesopotamia, people were already turning sunlight into usable energy, not with silicon panels, but with mud brick, clever geometry, and some good old-fashioned patience. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trail your fingers along the wall of a sun-dried brick house, its surface flaking like an old scroll. These bricks weren't baked in a fire, they were laid out under the sun, left to cure for days. This wasn't just lazy innovation. It was sustainable and quiet. Mud, straw, water, and sunlight. That's it. In fact, these early solar bricks were so reliable that they've outlasted many modern concrete buildings. Some still stand today, chipped but whole. Now picture this. A bustling courtyard in 2700 BCE. A woman bends over a flat slab of stone. She's not making art. She's drying dates, preserving fish, maybe even tanning leather, all laid out in precise patterns that maximize the solar angle. She doesn't call it solar drying. She just calls it Wednesday. But it's gentle tech, no less. It's solar-powered logistics wrapped in daily life. Mesopotamian kitchens weren't what you might imagine. There were no chimneys, no pots bubbling indoors. Instead, wide courtyards and rooftop terraces doubled as solar workspaces. The tanner, a kind of dome-shaped oven, was used not just for cooking over fire, but sometimes by using residual solar heat trapped in its clay body. Leave it baking in the sun all day, and by late afternoon it's warm enough to toast grain or even bake thin flatbread like an ancient solar slow cooker. Historians still argue whether these were intentional solar ovens or just coincidental heat traps. But the fact remains, these structures were designed to interact with sunlight. Some archaeologists have found cooking areas aligned to catch the most sunlight, which would be pointless if fire was the only fuel. They weren't exactly installing parabolic mirrors, but the idea of passive solar heating, alive and well. And remember those fancy outdoor solar dehydrators trending in eco-markets today? Yeah, Mesopotamia had that, only theirs didn't ship in biodegradable cardboard. From drying river reeds to preparing clay tablets for writing, nearly every aspect of daily life was tied to the rhythms of the sun. When the sun was up, work began. When the shade came, it meant time to move, flip, cover, or rest. There's even some speculation, just speculation, mind you, that certain rooftop domes were designed to concentrate sunlight onto a single focal point, much like a solar forge. That sounds impressive. And yes, the archaeologists who suggested are met with raised eyebrows and long academic sighs. But still, the geometry lines up, and those domes reflect a kind of architectural cleverness that doesn't feel accidental. But let's shift gears literally. Imagine a potter's wheel gliding under sunlight, its freshly thrown clay bowl glistening like wet stone. That bowl would be left to dry in carefully timed exposure. If it stayed too long, cracks formed. Too little, and it stayed soft. The potter didn't use a clock, she used the sun's position on her courtyard wall. That's not just weather sense, it's an understanding of thermal physics, long before anyone used the term. Quirky tidbit time. Some Sumerian households reportedly buried clay jars in sunlit sandpits to ferment drinks faster. The jars heated in the sun, and the warm microclimate kickstarted the process, essentially the Mesopotamian version of homebrew kombucha. Whether that makes them hipsters or not, you decide. And now let's zoom in on something oddly intimate: laundry. Yes, laundry. Clean clothes were rinsed in river water, scrubbed with ash or soapwort, then laid out in patterns to dry, not just for efficiency, but to prevent fading. They knew where the light would be harshest at midday and arranged the garments in sequence. Honestly, it sounds like the Mesopotamian version of laying out your grid on Instagram. only dustier. The point is, the sun wasn't just background noise, it was a tool. It dictated cooking, cleaning, storing, preserving, and even socializing. And just as we today design smart homes to adjust their shades and temperatures automatically, the ancient Mesopotamians built with sun patterns in mind. A window wasn't just a hole, it was a thermal valve. And get this, some courtyard houses had high reflective surfaces, polished gypsum or limestone that bounced light deeper into shaded interiors. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional design or a happy accident, but either way, it worked. Light entered softly, heat was distributed, and people adjusted their routines accordingly. You pause now beside a low wall, its top slick with centuries of sand polish. The sun has long dipped below the horizon, but the bricks still radiate heat. It's the thermal echo of a civilization that, without photovoltaic panels, without batteries or code, still figured out how to borrow sunlight gently, quietly, and ingeniously. And in a way, isn't that what we're still trying to do? You step through a narrow alleyway between houses, where the heat of the day still clings to the walls like a warm shawl. The street is silent now, but 5,000 years ago, it would have been filled with quiet action baskets being moved, tools being laid out, meals prepared without flame. You look up and see rooftops dotted with oddly shaped ceramic objects, some tilted at peculiar angles toward the sun. To a casual eye, they might seem decorative, or maybe like containers left out to dry. But to someone watching more closely, they're deliberate instruments. Solar tools. Gentle tech. Let's talk about mirrors. Well, the Mesopotamian version. No sleek silvered glass here, but rather thin sheets of polished bronze or obsidian, hand-burnished until they caught and bent light. These weren't just for checking your eyeliner, though yes, personal grooming was high art. Some scholars speculate that such mirrors may have been used to direct sunlight, either for drying, ceremonial light manipulation, or in some wildly speculative corners of academia, to start fires. Yep, Mesopotamian solar lighters. Historians still argue whether these polished surfaces were bright enough to ignite tinder, or if that idea is just modern projection. But archaeological evidence does suggest that mirrors were positioned with care, stored vertically near windows, and often aligned with other reflective materials. It's hard to prove intent across millennia, but the sun's role as more than illumination seems quietly embedded in their routines. Now imagine a garden. Not a wild, sprawling jungle, but a carefully walled courtyard with clay planters, where sun exposure was monitored like a sleepy astronomer tracking Venus. Certain plants were shaded at peak noon, others left to soak until their leaves curled slightly. They didn't call it UV sensitivity, but they knew the signs. Some urban households even painted the outsides of clay pots white not for aesthetics, but to reflect sunlight and regulate internal temperature. That's passive solar cooling in action, no user manual required. Then there's the mysterious case of the sun pit. Found in a few sites like Tel Break and Nippur, these were shallow depressions lined with stones or bricks, open to the sky. Some archaeologists believe they were used for sun-drying specific materials, perhaps salt, fish, or even early photographic-like impressions using heat and pressure. Others argue these pits served religious or symbolic purposes. The truth is, we don't fully know, but their presence suggests a formal relationship with sunlight one that went beyond just, don't let your food rot. Speaking of food, let's pause on preservation. You crouch down beside a reed basket filled with figs. They're sliced and laid on flat trays, arranged not just for airflow, but also for optimal sun exposure. No artificial additives, just solar dehydration, carefully timed. Texts from the period even reference storing dried goods by the moon cycle, implying a calendrical knowledge of spoilage, temperature, and dryness. There's a rhythm to it, a knowledge passed down by calloused hands and sunburned cheeks. Quirky sidebar. One cuneiform tablet describes a sun-offering ritual in which cooked grain was left to sit in a sunbeam before serving. Was it symbolic, microbially practical, or just the ancient version of letting it cool off on the windowsill? Historians shrug, but the fact it was recorded hints at sunlight having not just physical, but spiritual or social utility. And now we get to solar kilns. Yes, actual attempts at least theorized to concentrate sunlight for pottery firing. Though traditional kilns were powered by wood or dung, some outliers show signs of walls built at a slant, with highly reflective interiors. Were they experimenting, playing with the idea of the sun as fire's cousin? One site near modern-day Eridu features a sloped structure that, when reconstructed digitally, channels sunlight almost perfectly into a central cavity. Again, no proof, just a tantalizing architectural shrug. You walk onward and pass a man crouched over a clay tablet, his stylus tapping out numbers. He's not writing poetry, he's tracking the sun. Mesopotamians were already dividing daylight into measurable units, some based on sundials slabs of stone with carved grooves to mark shadow positions. Early solar tech wasn't all heat and cooking, it was time itself. And even time, in their world, was a kind of gentle machinery powered by the arc of the sun across the sky. We even have evidence of early gnomons, vertical poles used to cast tracking shadows. In one famous case, a temple courtyard contained a perfectly centered stone post surrounded by etched curves. At specific times of day and season, shadows aligned with these etchings, allowing priests to determine festival timing, crop cycles, and even divination rituals. It was astronomy without telescopes, cosmic tech made local. Now let's detour into cosmetics. Yes, cosmetics. You find a tiny alabaster jar filled with shimmery green paste. This isn't just for glow-ups, it's a heat-resistant eye paint made from copper-based minerals like malachite. Women, and some men, used it not only for beauty but to reflect sunlight away from the eyes. Think of it as ancient solar glare protection, functional makeup chic, and SPF friendly. Quirky tidbit, there are also depictions of parasol-like items used in royal processions, shading not just people, but sacred objects. And while umbrellas aren't solar tech per se, they indicate an understanding of sunlight as something to manage, not merely endure. Shade wasn't laziness, it was engineering. And now, tucked in a shaded corner, you spot something peculiar, a bowl of what looks like crushed charcoal mixed with ash. In some villages, this was used as a form of solar ink. Left out in the sun to thicken, the paste darkened and hardened, later applied with styluses to record darker markings on soft clay, sort of a Mesopotamian marker pen. Again, no definitive consensus, but the process is described in fragmentary texts as being baked by Shamash, the sun god. That's a poetic way of saying, leave it in the sun for a bit. So you stand now, surrounded by the quiet hum of all this gentle tech. No wires, no hums, no blinking lights, just sun, mud, metal, reflection, and human curiosity. They didn't need to conquer the sun. They collaborated with it. And somehow it worked. You follow the narrow street to its quiet end, where a public square opens up, one that feels more ceremonial than social. There's no chatter here, no market stalls or bread vendors, just a scattering of low stone platforms, a few broken columns, and a raised altar at the center. Everything's aligned just a bit too precisely to be accidental. You squint at the angle of the shadows. If you stand still long enough, you start to see it. This space is tuned to the sun. Ceremonial sun tech, arguably the most poetic of all the Mesopotamian experiments in solar power. Temples weren't just places of prayer. They were light machines, clock towers without ticking hands. Take the ziggurat, for example. A stepped pyramid that some say might have doubled as a kind of astronomical tool. As the sun moved, shadows from the different tiers fell across marked courtyards or sacred pools, telling priests more than just the time. They told stories, dates, festivals, the very rhythm of life. Historians still argue whether these alignments were deliberate engineering or convenient coincidence. But the consistency of orientation, often east-west or tied to equinoxes, makes it hard to believe it was all just guesswork. Especially when you see that some temples even had specific windows, cut to catch the first morning light at certain times of year. Imagine designing a building just so a sunbeam could touch a god's statue on one special day. That's architecture as calendar, stonework as sundial. And speaking of gods, you can't stroll too far without encountering Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun deity, always watching, always shining. His image appears on seals, in hymns, and in more than a few legal tablets. Yes, legal tablets. Because Shamash wasn't just about warmth and light, he was the god of justice. The metaphor was too perfect. Light reveals all, nothing hides in the sun. It's the original truth comes to light energy. So when Mesopotamians recorded their laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, famously chiseled in basalt, many did so with overt references to the sun. The idea was that justice should be clear, visible, and unavoidable, almost like the solar-powered truth detector of the ancient world. And yes, that famous stele includes a depiction of Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the radiant god sitting on a throne of flames. But not all sunlight was about judgment. Some rituals used light more gently. In spring festivals, priests would carry mirrors or polished bowls to catch the dawn, letting first light bounce into the temple's inner sanctum. This was believed to energize offerings, awaken statues, or literally bring warmth to sacred texts. It's a subtle kind of solar tech ritual, sure, but also a well-studied dance with optics and timing. If you've ever tried to bounce sunlight off a mirror into a room for more than 5 seconds, you know it's not easy. And then there's the dreamier stuff, the bits that drift into fringe territory but are too poetic to ignore. Some fringe scholars argue that certain Mesopotamian lens-like artifacts, possibly made of quartz or other crystals, were used to concentrate sunlight for reading in low-light spaces. Think of it as early flashlight tech, powered by the mid-afternoon sun and a very steady hand. No hard evidence, but some surviving polished objects could function this way, and the idea certainly feels romantic. You, in a quiet stone room, tilting a crystal just right to read a line of poetry by sunray. It's almost too bedtime perfect not to imagine. One undeniable piece of ceremonial solar tech: the solstice markers. In some ancient cities, stellae upright stone markers were set to align with the rising or setting sun during equinoxes and solstices. Stand at the right spot, on the right day, and sunlight would slip between columns or hit a carved symbol dead center. No smartphone notifications required, just patience, memory, and trust in the sky. You kneel beside one of these markers now, brushing away imaginary dust, and trace the grooves with your fingers. It's humbling to think that someone carved these knowing they might outlast their own grandchildren, knowing that long after they were gone, the sun would keep showing up on time. Of course, not every structure was grand. Some sun tools were humble, almost invisible. House altars with sun slits, small vertical openings aligned to morning light, may have been used for quiet rituals, or even as early alarm clocks. Light hits the altar, eels time to feed the goats. Practical, spiritual, and gently techy, all rolled into one soft sunrise. And while we're being practical, let's take a moment to appreciate clothes. Yes, clothes. Some Mesopotamian garments, especially those of the upper class, were not only decorative but designed for heat reflection. Pale linen, layered and loose, reflected sunlight while maintaining airflow. Some even had metallic thread woven in for ceremonial outfits, possibly to shimmer in the sun and reflect heat. Practical fashion meets low-tech climate control. There's also speculation about scented oils used in sun rituals. Certain oils, when exposed to sunlight, deepen in color and fragrance. Texts reference leaving them to ripen under shamash. It's essentially solar infusion, a technique still used today in perfume making. Except back then it came with prayers and a whole lot of clay jars. You lean back against a warm wall and imagine the sun creeping slowly over the city. Not just rising, but powering, guiding, flavoring, timing, sanctifying. To us, solar power might mean shiny panels and voltage charts. To them, it was woven into everything. Gentle, quiet, and constant. A cosmic collaborator. By now, the shadows are stretching long across the square, and the light has softened to amber. You feel it on your skin, not just as heat, but as memory, as design, as quiet, ancient tech. The street narrows again as you wander onward, and soon you find yourself in a quieter quarter, one not marked by temples or altars, but by tools, trades, and terracotta. You pause near a low bench lined with clay vessels, many of them scorched just slightly on one side. It's a subtle detail, but it says a lot. This is the working class side of sun tech. You're in a potter's alley now where practical solar use shined brightest, quite literally. In the intense heat of southern Mesopotamia, craftsmen began to notice that placing unfired clay vessels at certain angles allowed the sun to partially dry and cure the material faster. They weren't exactly baking the pots by sunlight alone. Kilns were still essential, but sun-drying shaved precious hours off production time. For a potter trying to make enough amphorae before festival day, that was the difference between profit and scolding. And they didn't stop there. Some of the finer glazed pieces, researchers believe, were sun-treated after firing laid out in specific arrangements to deepen the colors or toughen the sheen. It's speculative, but tests on ancient shards reveal surprising uniformity in solar exposure, like they were laid out with method, not accident. Imagine a courtyard ringed with terracotta, all tilted like sleepy sunflower heads, soaking up the perfect afternoon rays. Fringe historians even argue for a kind of solar kiln experiment, where mirrors or polished copper discs focused heat onto a central firing pit. There's no hard proof yet, But one unearthed structure near Lagash includes what some believe were reflective surfaces angled around a low basin. If true, it would represent one of the earliest human attempts to concentrate sunlight for heat, a proto-laser oven, minus the sci-fi flair. You crouch beside a dusty work table and spot something odd, a lump of hardened resin or pitch, oddly smooth and dark. Ancient adhesives, as it turns out, were sometimes sun-tempered. They'd leave the mixture exposed during the hottest part of the day, allowing evaporation to thicken it just right before application. It's humble chemistry, no beakers or goggles, just observation, repetition, and patience. And of course, sunshine. Now lift your eyes. See that wide wooden ramp angling up into the ruins of what was once a grand workshop? That's more than a loading dock. In some sites, similar ramps were used to test shadow lengths and angles at different times of day. They may have even served as primitive time trackers. Workers might mark the wood with soot or chalk as shadows crept along, noting when the kiln was hottest or when the resin was ready. It's solar tech without wires, just wood, intuition, and a lot of squinting. Let's step into another workspace now, a tannery perhaps. Less glamorous, sure, but just as quietly clever. Sunlight was essential here, not just for drying hides, but for triggering chemical changes. Some tanning solutions reacted with solar heat to break down proteins faster. It was messy, smelly science, but it worked. The sun, again, doing half the heavy lifting for free. And here's a strange little detail to fall asleep thinking about. It wasn't uncommon for workers to talk to the sun. Not prayers, necessarily, but muttered instructions. A little more, then cloud over. It sounds silly now, but when your entire workday hinges on the whims of the sky, you treat it like a colleague, or at least a temperamental intern with far too much power. Down another lane, we find brewers, yes, brewers also making use of solar timing. Brewing beer in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't just a pastime, it was a livelihood. And the fermentation process often relied on specific sun exposure windows to ensure consistent temperatures. Too hot, and the mash soured. Too little heat, and fermentation stalled. So some brewers developed roof slats and sunscreens to regulate how much solar warmth their vats received. It's a solar thermostat made of sticks and gut instinct. Historians still argue whether this degree of control was intentional science or lucky trial and error. But when multiple breweries in different cities show the same structural tricks, it starts to feel like a pattern, like knowledge shared across dusty miles and whispered through generations. And let's not forget about food. In homes and markets alike, solar drying was a trusted preservation method. Fish, dates, herbs laid out on woven mats, angled with care, sometimes sprinkled with brine or ash. The timing mattered. Too much sun could bleach flavor, too little meant spoilage. Families pass down sun recipes the way we pass down grandma's banana bread formula, complete with timing tricks like start when the cat's shadow is finger length. One fringe theory suggests some markets had communal sun shelves, shared platforms placed in courtyards for neighborhood drying. It's sweet to imagine, neighbors chatting, trading drying tips, kids chasing lizards in the shade, all while their food slowly absorbed the day's energy. A community microwave, powered by the gods. And speaking of sharing the sun, here's a curious little engineering tidbit: clay piping. In wealthier homes or public bathhouses, sun-warmed water was often preferred, not boiling, just pleasantly hot. Some researchers believe they used long stretches of clay piping exposed to sunlight to gently pre-warm the water before it entered a basin. Early solar plumbing, not exactly a power shower, but pretty fancy for the 3rd millennium BCE. You sit on a broken step now, imagining the full rhythm of one solar-charmed day. Pots setting, oils thickening, hides darkening, beer bubbling, all coordinated not by clocks or apps, but by shadow and intuition. The sun wasn't just overhead, it was everywhere, infused in the chores, the gossip, the meals. In a way, you're seeing the city as it truly lived, not in its ziggurats or royal stellies, but in its drying racks, mirrored bowls, and sun-slicked ramps. Quiet tech, low drama, high function. A symphony of sweat, sunlight, and slow mastery. You close your eyes and feel the ghost of it. The flicker of warmth against clay, the smell of baked resin, the dusty taste of sun-thickened dates. The streets begin to blur now, fading from sharp stone and shadow to something softer, more abstract, like a city drawn in heat mirage and remembered dreams. You drift further from the bustling workyards and closer to the fringe of daily life, where the rhythms of ancient solar tech softened into something almost spiritual. Here, in the older, quieter part of the settlement, you stumble across what looks like a sundial, but it's not the rigid, formal timepiece you might expect. It's a patch of polished limestone, barely raised above the soil, with no clear markings. Just a few faint concentric grooves and the remnant of a standing post in the center. It wasn't meant to tell the hour with precision. This was a shadow altar used during seasonal festivals or personal rituals. When the sun reached a certain height and cast the right kind of shadow, thin, soft-edged, angled just so, people believed it was time to speak. Not to one another, but to the forces that governed crops, illness, children, luck. This wasn't tech for productivity, it was tech for presence, an interface between people and the sky. Historians still debate whether these altars predated the formal ziggurat calendars or were their humble cousins' local versions used by commoners without access to temple scribes. And these weren't just functional slabs, they were sometimes built with subtle slopes, designed so that as the sun rose, the sleeper would be warmed at just the right rate. It's a primitive version of sunrise alarm clocks, minus the Bluetooth. Imagine lying on a clay pillow, face cooled by desert wind, your dreams stirred not by noise but by the hush of sunlight moving slowly across your blanket. You didn't set a wake time, the sky decided for you. Next to the terrace, a small basin remains, etched with tiny cup-like indents along its rim. These are solar water clocks, rudimentary but clever. Kids, it seems, had their own solar tech. They played shadow games chasing each other's outlines, timing how long it took for your shadow to reach the wall. They played guess the time challenges, using rocks and finger lengths. Some even crafted mini sundials from twigs, just for fun. One fringe interpretation suggests a sort of child-led science here, a way that observation and play help the next generation internalize solar rhythms. No textbooks, no quizzes, just noticing, giggling, pretending to be the sun. And maybe that's the softest, most human version of this whole ancient technology. Not the mirrored bowls or thermal pipes, but the way people, young and old, paid attention. They didn't dominate the sun, they listened to it, followed it, played with it, designed lives around it. And that, quietly, is the root of solar power. Not a switch or a panel, but a relationship. You breathe out slowly, still seated near the worn terrace stones. The day here feels endless. No buzz of cities, just slow light, smoothed stone, the murmur of the Tigris on the horizon. A forgotten civilization, basking in the same sun you did today. And as the scene dims behind your eyelids, you realize solar tech in Mesopotamia wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. It was gentle, constant, and collaborative, just like the sunrise tomorrow. Let's slow things down now. Deeper breaths, longer pauses. You're lying on that ancient rooftop once more, a flat bed of sun-baked clay beneath your shoulders, a gentle wind curling around your ears. The sounds of the old city have quieted to a hush. Footsteps softened, voices faded. Even the birds have quieted into still silhouettes. Above you, the stars blink awake. Quiet companions, watching just as they did thousands of years ago, when sun-aligned terraces still welcomed sleepers and soft shadows danced across pottery kilns. You feel the weight of warmth residual from the day lingering on the stone. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. You imagine the little basin of rose water evaporating beside you, leaving its faint perfume in the air, mingling with the scent of clay and distant river reeds. Somewhere, someone once whispered a quiet prayer at a shadow altar, waiting for just the right line to appear. They didn't rush, they just waited, trusted the sun to tell them when. Let that patience sink in. There's no need to race toward anything now. The world is old, and it's not in a hurry. You're wrapped in that calm, that confidence, that ancient rhythm. So rest now. Let your thoughts melt like morning dew on a sunlit ramp. Let them slip down the tiles of that sleeping terrace and drift into the dust of dreams. There's no place to be, no shadow to chase, just stillness. Just quiet, just sleep.